I was in Marrakesh in November 2016, and I had a brief episode of pure optimism. The supermoon overlooking the night market provided an extraordinary backdrop to the 22nd Conference of Parties, the annual global conference on climate change. And the crowd moving through the dark and narrow streets and negotiating the enticing food carts included heads of state, journalists, activists, scientists, and critically, executives from global energy companies. The moonrise was, of course, very inspirational, but it was a stark reminder of planetary fragility under a changing climate. Across the Atlantic, the supermoon had coincided with tidal flooding in Florida and an unprecedented federal election in the United States. Despite the seemingly unending stream of bad news and challenges, I felt optimistic that for the very first time, we had an opportunity to design an energy system architecture that simultaneously addressed climate challenges and created tremendous economic opportunities in a low-carbon economy. Energy was at the center of that brief moment of clarity. Access to energy has reduced poverty around the world by more than half since 1990, and yet more than 1 billion people still live without access to the most basic energy services. On top of that, those of us who are lucky enough to have access to those services need to face the mounting evidence on the negative impacts of the energy system. And there are 3 grand categories of impacts. The first category is related to health. According to the World Health Organization, there are more than 9 million premature deaths around the world due to pollution. And that is more than the deaths occurring from HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis combined. The second category of impacts is the prospect of global environmental disaster due to climate change. The disruption of global food supplies, the increased damages from fires and other natural disasters are just a few examples of the potential risks. The third category of impacts is related to the geopolitical stability that our energy system may enable as we compete for increasingly scarce resources like oil, water, cobalt. Now, there are very powerful forces driving the evolution of the energy system. And before we look at some of the characteristics of a future sustainable energy system, it may be wise to look back before we can look forward. And it all started with the discovery of fire. For the very first time, it was possible to convert an energy source into services that people wanted: heating, safety, illumination, and perhaps even communication. The transition from biomass to coal took thousands of years, but when the steam engine arrived, it revolutionized the world. For the very first time, it was possible to achieve large-scale productivity without forced labor. And the first revolution in transportation was also possible. Soon, global trade networks connected continents across the oceans, and the part of the world with the key technology became a global superpower. About 100 years later, we moved from coal to oil. And because oil is a liquid, it can be pumped and piped across long distances. Across the Atlantic, the internal combustion engine was invented, and it revolutionized personal mobility. Soon, electrification and telecommunication technologies started to connect the world in an unprecedented way. But we also started to see some of the problems associated with fossil fuels. More recently, we are seeing a transition to natural gas. And even though this is a cleaner source compared to other fossil sources, it still has some of the legacy problems associated with fossil fuels. So, 4 grand transitions, from biomass to coal to oil to gas. If you look at the relative amount of carbon in the primary energy source of choice during these transitions, you will notice that the energy system has been progressively decarbonized even before climate change or environmental impacts were public concerns. So that's the first big trend, decarbonization. The second trend is the explosive population growth that we have experienced in the last few hundred years. In addition to population growth, we are also seeing changes in the way that people live. And by 2050, 60 or 70% of global population will be living in cities. So urbanization is the third trend driving the evolution of the energy system. Decarbonization, population growth, and urbanization. Connecting it all is the increasing digitization of our world as we become a digital society and a digital economy. And these trends have become part of a global narrative that can be best illustrated by a tale of three cities: Paris, Marrakesh, and Bonn. In 2015, the Paris Climate Accord was signed, and a large number of countries agreed to set targets to keep the global rise in temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius. A year later, in Marrakesh, and for the first time, some of the required investment was quantified, and it was estimated that approximately $40 trillion of additional investment would be required to change our energy system. Critically, new investor classes like sovereign wealth funds and pension funds may now be open to change their investment strategies. Last year in Bonn, for the very first time, strong voices made a case for opening up the financial instruments from development banks and other entities that until recently have been only available to central governments. So the role of cities and states became more pronounced. More importantly, the narrative around the global political agreement was now concrete, and very specific recommendations were made at that conference. In particular, transportation was identified as a critical area. So I'm going to use the transportation sector to illustrate some of the challenges and opportunities. And I use transportation because transportation is special. We can do many things with electricity, but if we want to move an airplane, a large ship, we need a chemical fuel. Now, as you look at the transitions in the transportation sector, you will notice that in the same way that the overall energy system has decarbonized, the same thing has happened to the transportation sector. In British Columbia, the transportation sector is responsible for 40% of all greenhouse emissions. So transportation is one of the key challenges of the new energy system architecture. I feel very fortunate to be leading a project right here at UBC that is going to be looking at some of these future transportation concepts. And we will be using urban assets that are very familiar. Cars and parking garages are two of the most underutilized assets anywhere in the world. Cars can remain stationary for more than 80% of the time, and parking garages are large concrete structures that, of course, hold our cars, but according to my colleagues in architecture, they also kill the soul of our cities. So we will be taking one of the parking garages on campus and adding solar panels to the roof. And we are using solar energy as a proxy for renewable energy technologies at maturity. One of the key challenges of renewable electricity is that we cannot store electricity in large quantities, and that the production of the renewable electricity is intermittent. When the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing, we don't have access to that electricity production. Now, we can use batteries to store electricity, and as it turns out, we're going to have large numbers of mobile batteries as electric vehicles penetrate the transportation system. So can we aggregate large numbers of electric vehicles in a parking garage to essentially create a city-scale battery? In this way, vehicles and buildings move from a situation where they are passive assets to a situation where they are active participants in city-scale energy management transactions. And this is exactly what we're going to be doing at UBC. We will also be adding a refueling station that will be producing hydrogen. And we can go back to our high school chemistry, where we take electricity to split the water molecule into hydrogen and oxygen. Once you have produced hydrogen, you have effectively taken renewable electrons and converted them into a chemical fuel that can be stored in large quantities. We can then take that hydrogen and refuel fuel cell vehicles that are becoming commercially available in Germany, California, Japan, and soon in Canada. You can also take some of that hydrogen and inject it into the gas pipelines, thereby lowering the carbon content of natural gas, and at the same time storing renewable electricity in a very large storage vessel, the natural gas grid. This integration of technologies is what we like to call energy convergence. Basically, the ability to provide new or additional services by combining smart technologies that were not connected before. And this will have tremendous repercussions in our energy system. I could not think of a better time to be working in some of these areas. And I really hope that by the time the next supermoon arises in 2034, some of these solutions will be a reality. UBC is leading the way, and we can extrapolate from the solutions on campus to cities and other countries around the world. Thank you.